They thought their cruelty would be forgotten. On a quiet night, officers tied a black woman to a tree, laughing as if her pain was nothing more than a joke. To them, she was powerless, just another victim whose cries would vanish into the dark. But what they didn't know was that this moment, this act of humiliation, would ignite something far greater than their mockery. Who was this woman they tried to break, and how did she rise to become a force that rewrote history? Hit subscribe to join our community. Before that night under the tree, she was not a name the world knew. She was a daughter, a mother, a friend, someone who carried the weight of her community's struggles on her shoulders. She lived in a world where skin color meant survival was never guaranteed, where dignity was constantly tested, and where silence often felt safer than truth. Yet, even in the face of constant judgment, she held her head high. Her days were filled with work that seemed invisible to most, organizing small gatherings, offering shelter to those turned away, and speaking softly but firmly about justice when others were too afraid. Many dismissed her as ordinary, but those who truly knew her saw a quiet strength that refused to bend. She was not chasing fame or power. She was chasing fairness, the kind she had rarely been given. And still, nothing could have prepared her for the cruelty that was about to unfold. The tree, the ropes, the laughter of those sworn to protect, it wasn't just an attack on her body. It was an attack on her very existence, a reminder of how deep racism runs. But what they failed to realize was that every insult, every injustice, was shaping her into something unbreakable. The question was no longer whether she would survive this humiliation, but how far the impact of her survival would reach. What begins as an attempt to silence her would soon become the very reason her voice could never again be ignored. The night she was tied to that tree was not just a single act of cruelty. It was the weight of centuries pressing down on one body. The officers laughed, their voices cutting through the silence, certain that no one would ever challenge them. For them, this was routine. For her, it was a test of endurance, a moment when humiliation could have broken her spirit completely. But she had lived through humiliation before. As a child, she was told she did not belong in schools where others learned freely. As a teenager, she was denied jobs because her skin was too dark for the front desk. Every stage of her life had been shadowed by rejection and inequality. Yet with each wound, she refused to surrender. What the officers saw as weakness, her body bound, her voice trembling, was in truth the beginning of transformation. She knew that if she survived this night, if she walked away alive, she could no longer remain silent. Silence had protected her once, but now it would betray her. In the days that followed, the marks on her wrists became symbols she carried with her, not scars of defeat, but reminders of why she had to keep fighting. Her community, outraged and frightened, gathered around her. Some whispered that standing against the system would only bring more pain. Others begged her to stay quiet for her safety. Yet she could see it in their eyes. They were tired of being afraid, tired of being voiceless. And so she began to speak. Not in grand speeches at first, but in living rooms, church basements, and schoolyards. She told her story, not to seek pity, but to demand recognition. Each retelling was raw, painful, and real. And people listened because they knew it was the truth. The very officers who had mocked her, who thought their laughter would echo louder than her voice, had unknowingly handed her the most powerful weapon she would ever wield, her story. The question that now lingered was not whether she could endure the cruelty, but whether her voice could carry far enough to challenge the very system that had once tried to silence her. Her voice spread further than anyone expected. What began as whispers in small gatherings grew into a roar that could no longer be ignored. Soon, newspapers printed her story, not as a tale of pity, but as a testimony of resistance. The image of a black woman tied to a tree by those sworn to protect became a symbol that unsettled even those who preferred silence. The officers who once laughed now watched as crowds gathered, chanting her name, demanding answers. What was supposed to be her humiliation had transformed into their exposure. And in that exposure, the nation was forced to confront a truth it had long tried to bury. But the battle was not easy. She faced threats, intimidation, and even betrayal from those who feared the backlash her courage would bring. Every step forward came with resistance from powerful systems determined to silence her again. Yet, every attempt to push her down only fueled her determination. The most defining moment came when she stood before a courthouse, surrounded by hundreds of people who had come to stand with her. Her voice, steady and unbroken, echoed across the crowd as she told the world exactly what had happened under that tree. She did not cry, nor did she plead. She spoke the truth, plain and undeniable, and in that truth lay her strength. It was the moment the balance shifted. The woman once mocked as powerless had become a symbol of defiance, her story no longer her own, but the voice of countless others who had suffered in silence. The question now wasn't if the world would listen, but how far her courage would ripple through history. What began as a night of cruelty became the spark for a movement. The image of a black woman tied to a tree was no longer just a memory. It was a reminder of how far injustice could go if left unchallenged. But more importantly, it was proof that even in the face of humiliation, resilience could not be bound. Her story reached beyond her community. Colleges studied her words. Lawmakers cited her case in debates about justice reform. Young activists carried her image on posters, chanting her name as they marched. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a leader, even if she had never asked to be one. The same officers who had once mocked her now represented something far bigger, a broken system exposed under the weight of her truth. And though justice did not come overnight, the change had begun. Laws were questioned, policies were reviewed, and conversations that had long been silenced finally broke open. For her, the victory was never about fame or recognition. It was about ensuring that no other black woman, no other human being would have to endure what she had endured. The tree that once symbolized her shame became a symbol of resistance, etched in history as a turning point where silence ended and courage began. And yet, her story leaves us with a question. How many voices remain unheard because fear keeps them silent? How many stories of injustice go untold, waiting for someone brave enough to speak them into existence? The woman who was tied to a tree had been underestimated, ridiculed, and nearly erased. But in the end, she rewrote history, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they were powerless. If this story touched you, don't just watch, be part of the change. Hit subscribe and join our community of voices that matter.